Hey, I'm Courtney Waterman, your tutor. Lover of anime, manga, and math. And you just tuned into another session of Tutor Me Sempai. Welcome back, everyone. Today I'll be giving more math tips for the non-calculator portion of the PSAT. Today's tips will be focused on the FOIL method. If you're new to my channel, I'll be putting time codes in for this video in the description box below, so use that to skip ahead to any part of the video you deem most interesting. If you have any questions about what you see here or even your own homework, feel free to put them in the comment box below or visit me on Facebook at Tutor Me Sempai and tell me all about it there. When you find this video helpful, remember to leave a like, hit the notification bell, smash the subscribe button, and share this video with a friend. Well, without further ado, let's talk a little bit more about the FOIL method. So the first tip I have for you today regarding the FOIL method is know your letters from first to last. Understanding that FOIL stands for first, outer, inner, last is not enough. When I talk about knowing your letters from first to last, knowing how to FOIL is different from using a FOIL to solve your question. I want you to be able to use FOIL without actually having to do FOIL. So for example, let's say you had a quadratic that looked like this. Understanding how to use your FOIL method will allow you to set up your factors in such a way. Your first, understanding that first, if you have your factors in this form, your first means that you're going to be multiplying those. So in order to get something like this with this x squared, you're going to have an x in both of those places. Understanding how to use your FOIL without necessarily having to do your FOIL. You see, we're not actually FOILing anything out, but we're using how we would FOIL in order to set up our factors. The same thing can be said for this L here. So notice your last is going to be something like that when you're FOILing. However, if this C is a constant, then you know if you have an M and an N here, M times N is going to have to equal C. So when you're setting up your factors in this form and you have this C constant, understanding that your FOIL, the L in your FOIL, is going to require you to multiply these two constants together and they have to equal that C. Understanding how to use your FOIL without necessarily having to do your FOIL. That is what this tip 1 means. But we don't want to just stop there. Knowing your letters from first to last doesn't mean we're just going to figure out the really most basic form of FOIL. Sometimes we have a little bit more that we have to do, and I think this will be very important for you to know as well. So let's say we have something like ax squared plus bx plus c. So the only difference is we have a leading coefficient that is different from just 1. And then you're trying to set up your factors. Well, understanding that first, your first part of your FOIL is going to have you multiply these two numbers. Previously, we just put an x here because it was just a 1. But really knowing your letter, your first, that F, is going to show you that you're going to need two constants here. And when you multiply that together, that M and that N in this case is going to equal A. So whatever your M and N is going to be, when you multiply them together, they have to equal that A. And if this C is still a constant, then you still have your P's and Q's here, in which PQ is going to equal C. Another little bit of information that you should probably know at a glance is how is your FOIL going to look after you finish? What are the different parts at play once you finish your FOIL? This is going to be really important in saving time because without having to do FOIL, you already know the general form. So let's say you have something like this. I know from the first part of my FOIL, that's going to result in something with an x squared, just because my x's are here. I also know that my last is going to result in something with a y squared because my y's are here. And my outer and inner, when you combine everything, I'm going to have a mixture of both. So whatever my coefficients are, I know the general form of the result is going to be something like this, with an x squared, a y squared, and an xy in the middle. Some coefficient is going to be in front of each one, but we know that this is going to be the general form. And this is going to be key, especially when you're trying to quickly solve some answers without having to multiply everything out. So really try to understand your letters from first to last. First, outer, inner, last. from first to last, understanding how you can use these without having to always do the FOIL method. So let's say we have this question here, in which we're given the expression 12x squared plus ax minus 20, and we're told that we have a factor of 3x plus 4. We're trying to find out what is the value of a. And notice we don't have any options here. This is going to be one of the open-ended questions in your non-calculated portion, so you don't really have anything to kind of play with. So let's use our FOIL without necessarily having to do the FOIL. Let's use our FOIL to try to set up what that other factor would have to look like. From our FOIL, our first is going to have to result in something that equals this 12. Well, what times 3 is going to equal that 12? That's going to be a 4. Right? And it has to be an x squared, so this has an x, and this is going to have an x. We know from our L, this 20 is going to be the result of two constants multiplied together. Well, they already give us one of these constants, and that's a 4. So what times 4 gives us a 20? Well, that's going to be a 5. And we know the sign of this 20. This is positive, and this is negative, so the resulting sign is going to be what? Negative. So you see how we used our FOIL in order to find our missing factor, but we haven't foiled anything out yet. But notice we aren't finished. We just found the missing factor, which is going to be useful, but we have to find what this a equals. So now that we have both of our factors written out like this, now we can go on to our next tip. Our tip 2 for today is going to be use only the necessary letters. Don't FOIL everything out when you're just trying to find one part. Use only the necessary letters. We're only trying to find this a here. So why should we have to do f or this l when we're trying to multiply this out? Are we going to FOIL everything out? No, that's too much work and that's too much time wasted. Focus just on the necessary letters. In order to find this a, we know that's going to be a result of our outer and inner. So let's just go straight to those. Our outer is going to be this 3x times this negative 5. So what do you get when you have 3x times negative 5? A negative 15x. And this inner is going to be this 4 times this 4x. So what do you get when you do 4 times 4x? A positive 16x. So we're not going to worry about the first or the last because we're just trying to find out the value of a. So when you combine all this, what do you get? Well, this is going to be a resulting x. 1 is understood. You don't have to necessarily write 1, but it's a resulting x. So if this is our answer, what is our a then? In this case, a is going to be 1. So let's say we're given a question like this. Here we're given a factor x minus 2 for the quadratic x squared minus bx plus b, and we're trying to find what is b. We know b is a constant, but we're trying to find what is the value of b. Well, let's use our FOIL again. We are going to know our letters and reconstruct this missing factor. So our f is going to tell us that we're going to have an x here. There's no leading coefficient here, so we know we're just going to have a resulting x. And although we don't necessarily know what this constant is, just from first glance, we're told that b is a constant, so we know that this has to be some constant as well that we're going to be using to find that b. And we are also told that this is a positive b. And we have a negative here, so we know a negative times a negative results in a positive, so we know that's going to be a negative k here. So our L tells us that a negative 2 times a negative k gives us a positive b. And our outer and inner tell us that a negative 2 minus a k gives us a negative b. So you see, we're only trying to focus on the necessary letters. I haven't touched f here. So we can almost ignore f for this question. We only want to look at oil here. So here you can solve for your k and figure out what your b is, what it has to be. But if you notice something, you can save a little bit more time. Here you have 2 times a constant equals b. And here you're saying 2 pretty much plus another constant because everything is negative. You can actually multiply this whole thing by negative 1 and not change anything. So let's say we did that. We have 2 plus k equals b. So let's say we have this here. We already said this is equivalent to what we just had, but everything is positive now. What do you see here that stands out to you? Well, you have 2 plus a constant equals b, and 2 times that same constant equals that same b. Well, what constant times 2 gives you the same thing whether you add it or multiply it? Well, that's going to be 2, right? 2 times 2 equals the same as 2 plus 2. So we know that k is going to be 2. Therefore, we know that b is going to be 4. Our answer for this question is 4. So before we move on to our next question, I want to highlight something that you might have missed in our first two examples. So in our previous example, we had this question here in which we used what we know about FOIL in order to find our missing factor. And in doing so, we were able to do our 2 times 2 has to equal that 2 plus 2 in order to find what this b was. And this was a result of our last, our 2 times 2, equaling our outer and inner result of 2 plus 2. However, I don't want you to fall into this trap of using this for every quadratic that you run into. This leads me into our tip 3. Take note of any leading coefficients. Notice our first example for today had a 12 as the leading coefficient, but our previous example had an understood 1. When you have an understood 1, then you know the result of your outer and inner is just going to simply be adding these two together. I should say combining because they could have a negative, 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 positive, positive, positive. So it's really going to be a result of combining these two together. However, you need to take note of leading coefficients. Leading coefficients can change your math. In our first example, we found a to be 1. However, if you were to do the same thing we did in our second example for our first example, your last would have resulted in a negative 20, which is good, but your outer inner result would have been something like negative 1. And that is because you haven't taken into account what these leading coefficients are doing when you're multiplying out your outer and inner. There is nothing changing any values when you have a leading coefficient of 1, but when you have something other than 1, you need to know that is going to change your math. So for our last question of the day, you have a lot of text here. To be honest, I don't want to read all this. When I see this, I'm like, oh. However, you don't necessarily need to read all this, and this is going to be the mind-blowing part of how knowing your letters from first to last can save a ton of time. Now you can read all this and potentially get confused by some extra information that they snuck into this question. But if you know your letters, you can see that you can pare this down just like that. So we have our factors of the form ax plus by times cx minus dy. And they give you a bunch of extra information here, but if you look, what they're really asking is what is the value of the coefficient of the xy term? Well, we know our letters from first to last, right? So which letters are going to give us our xy term? Is it going to be our F, O, I, or our L? Well, it's definitely not the F, and it's definitely not the L. It's just going to be our O and our I. So we can simply focus on the coefficients of our outer and inner and see what we get. So when we do our outer, we get an AD, but it's negative. When we do our inner, we get a positive BC. We don't need to worry about the variables because we're only focusing on the xy's. So we have a negative AD plus a BC. So if you look back at our question, you see something that is amazing. AD equals BC. So if AD equals BC and you have a negative AD plus BC, well, you just canceled out everything, right? So what is the coefficient of our middle xy term? It's 0. The answer to this is 0. So you don't even have to read the rest of this question. We don't care about AC equaling 18 or BD equaling 50 because those are your F and your L's. You can waste a lot of time trying to figure out how this is supposed to work for this question, but if you know your letters, you can pinpoint the one you need and just focus on that, bypassing all the fluff that exists in this question. And although this tip didn't necessarily come into play for our questions today, I have one more tip for you to kind of wrap up this video. If for whatever reason you have just drawn a blank on how to factor, I don't want you to feel like you can't use the quadratic formula. Although the quadratic formula can be pretty long, If you don't have any other choice, use the quadratic formula. Don't be afraid to use the quadratic formula when necessary. The goal of the PSAT is to answer every question. So if you have the time and you completely went blank on how to use your FOIL or how to find your factors, and you have this quadratic that you're staring at, use your quadratic formula and put an answer down. Some answer is better than no answer. So I hope you were following today's examples, and I hope you found today's tips helpful. Remember, knowing how to FOIL is very different from knowing how to use your FOIL. Knowing how to use your FOIL can get you out of a lot of jams where just knowing how to FOIL is not going to be as helpful. If you have any question about what you saw here today, or even your own homework, remember, you can put them in the comment box below, or you can visit me on Facebook at Tutor Me Sempai and tell me all about it there. If you haven't done so already, remember to leave a like, hit the notification bell, smash the subscribe button, and share this video with a friend. Well, that's all the time I have for today. I'm really hoping it's helped with your PSAT prep, and I'm looking forward to seeing you again next week. I'm Courtney, and this is another session of Tutor Me Senpai.